Teacher humiliated a student, didn't know her father was a billionaire. The classroom was buzzing with energy as students filed in, chatting and laughing. Desks were arranged in neat rows, and today's assignment was written on the large chalkboard at the front of the room. Amid the noise, a quiet girl named Lily sat alone near the back, nervously organizing her books. She wore simple, modest clothes that set her apart from her classmates. A few students cast glances her way, whispering under their breath, hinting at the judgment they held for her. The teacher, Mrs. Holloway, entered the room, immediately silencing the students. She was known for her strict demeanor and high expectations, often coming down hard on students who didn't meet her standards. Her gaze swept across the room and stopped on Lily, a familiar target of her disapproval. "Lily," she called out sharply, "where is your textbook? We're starting a new chapter today, and I don't see it on your desk." Lily's face flushed with embarrassment. She lowered her head, mumbling, "I forgot it at home, Mrs. Holloway." A smirk spread across Mrs. Holloway's face as she shook her head in disapproval. "Of course you did. You know, if you can't even bring the basics to class, maybe this place is too much for you." Her voice was loud enough for the entire class to hear, and a few students stifled laughs, enjoying the show. Lily could feel her cheeks burning, her eyes fixed on her desk as she tried to shrink into her seat. Her classmates snickered, some exchanging glances that said everything they thought about her: poor, lazy, and unworthy. Lily was a quiet, unassuming girl with a gentle demeanor. She wore simple clothes, plain jeans and a slightly worn sweater, that contrasted sharply with the designer outfits of her classmates. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she rarely looked anyone in the eye, as if afraid of drawing attention to herself. Lily was shy by nature, often retreating into herself to avoid the critical eyes and whispers of her peers. Beneath her soft-spoken exterior, Lily carried a nervous energy. She fidgeted with the corner of her notebook or tapped her fingers lightly against the desk when she thought no one was looking. Her expressive eyes darted around the room, wary and anxious, as though she was always waiting for the next comment or look that would remind her of her place among her wealthier classmates. Although Lily tried to blend into the background, her modest appearance often made her a target. The more she attempted to remain unseen, the more some classmates took notice, seizing any chance to poke fun at her or to question why she was in their class at all. Yet, even through her discomfort, there was a resilience in Lily. She endured the snide remarks and condescending looks, keeping her emotions in check as best as she could. It was clear that she carried a heavy burden, but she wore it with quiet grace, determined not to let others see how deeply their words affected her. Mrs. Holloway was the kind of teacher who commanded attention the moment she stepped into a room. Tall and sharply dressed, she had an air of authority that both intimidated and subdued her students. Her steely gaze scanned the classroom daily, noting who looked presentable and who didn't, who came prepared and who fell short. Known for her no-nonsense approach, Mrs. Holloway had little patience for students she considered unworthy of her time, especially those who didn't meet her personal standards of excellence. She openly favored students from affluent backgrounds, often praising them while ignoring or subtly reprimanding others. Her critical eye was quick to judge, and her words could cut like a knife, especially for those who struggled to keep up. To her, students like Lily were inconveniences, reminders of what she viewed as undesirable qualities. Mrs. Holloway believed firmly in tough love, yet her version often crossed into cruelty, especially when directed toward those who couldn't fight back. The classroom had settled into a hushed silence as Mrs. Holloway began her lecture, but her gaze fell once again on Lily. The other students followed her line of sight, almost anticipating what was coming next. Mrs. Holloway's eyes narrowed as she noticed Lily's desk was missing something crucial, the required textbook. Clearing her throat, Mrs. Holloway spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, her tone icy. "Lily," she said with a forced smile that dripped with disdain, "where is your textbook? Are we not prepared for class yet again?" Lily's heart sank as every pair of eyes turned toward her. She fumbled, trying to come up with an answer, but all she managed was a soft, "I forgot it at home." The teacher's smile faded, replaced by a scornful frown. "You forgot it? Again?" Mrs. Holloway's voice was filled with exaggerated disappointment. Do you even care about learning, Lily? Or maybe, just maybe, this school is too good for someone like you? A hush fell over the room, students exchanging looks that ranged from amused to uncomfortable. Lily's face turned red, and she tried to shrink down in her seat, feeling the weight of the room's gaze on her. She could feel her cheeks burning, her throat tightening as she struggled to hold back tears. The humiliation was overwhelming, and all she wanted to do was disappear. Mrs. Holloway continued, as if relishing the discomfort on Lily's face. "Some of you think you can waltz in here and just get by on pity," she added, pacing a little in front of the class. "But success requires dedication. If you can't even bring the most basic materials, perhaps you should rethink your priorities." Lily's hands shook under her desk as she clenched her fists, desperately trying to keep her emotions in check. Her eyes were glued to her desk, afraid that if she looked up, the tears she was barely holding back would spill over. She felt small, powerless, and utterly exposed in front of everyone. Some students smirked, enjoying the spectacle, while others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. They had seen Mrs. Holloway's wrath before, and most of them were glad they weren't the ones in her crosshairs. For them, this was just another moment in Mrs. Holloway's class, another reminder of what happened when someone didn't meet her standards. For Lily, though, this was yet another scar, a reminder that no matter how hard she tried to fit in, she would never be enough in the eyes of people like Mrs. Holloway. Have you ever found yourself judged unfairly like Lily? Maybe someone looked down on you because of your appearance, your background, or just because you didn't meet their standards. It can be painful and frustrating, especially when all you want is to be treated with respect. Think about a time when you faced this kind of judgment. How did it make you feel? Did it make you stronger, or did it leave a lasting mark? Share your experience in the comments. Let's remind each other that we're all worth more than the labels others place on us. Lily's days at school began to feel like a series of quiet battles. The first bell rang, and as she stepped into the hallway, a ripple of whispers followed her. The other students, oblivious to her presence, spoke as if she were invisible, yet every word seemed to strike her like a slap. She could hear the faint giggles, the mocking tones, and the occasional side-eyed glance aimed at her back. She tried to stay focused on getting to class, but every step felt heavier. In the cafeteria, Lily stood in line for her lunch, but when she looked for a place to sit, the empty seats around her seemed to grow larger. Her classmates, chatting and laughing in their cliques, all shifted subtly, creating an unspoken barrier. One of the girls in the back of the room, Emma, rolled her eyes and whispered loudly enough for Lily to hear, "Ugh, why does she even bother? She doesn't belong here." Lily's stomach tightened, but she didn't look up. She just kept walking, feeling the weight of every eye on her. She grabbed a tray, picked a seat at the far end of the cafeteria, and tried to make herself as small as possible. It wasn't new. It was just one more day of the same thing. Being an outsider, surrounded but completely alone. In the hallways, the isolation continued. She overheard one of the boys in her class speaking to a friend near her locker, clearly unaware that she could hear him. "She's such a charity case, always acting like she belongs here." His words were casual, as if Lily wasn't even there to hear them. His voice was full of disdain, and the insults stung deep. Lily tried not to let it show, but her heart sank. Each day, the ridicule became more overt. She'd hear snickers as she passed by groups of students who would talk in hushed tones but still glance at her, as if they couldn't help but make sure she knew they were talking about her. Her clothes, plain, unbranded, were often the subject of their jokes. The girl who sat behind her in history class once whispered to her friend, "I bet she got that sweater at a thrift store." It looks like it. The most hurtful part wasn't just the comments or the whispers, but the way her classmates' faces would light up in mock sympathy, as if they were doing her a favor by even acknowledging her existence. They'd pretend to be friendly for a moment, only to turn away as soon as her back was turned, their true feelings exposed. At times, Lily would sit at her desk, pretending to focus on the work in front of her, but the laughter, the sneers, the sideways glances would always find their way into her mind. She couldn't escape it. No matter how hard she tried to fit in, no matter how much she kept her head down, she was always reminded that she wasn't one of them. She wasn't good enough. Emma was everything Lily wasn't. confident, popular, and effortlessly beautiful. She always had the latest fashions, and her group of friends followed her like loyal disciples, hanging on every word she said. Emma's demeanor was sharp, her words calculated to cut deep, and she always knew how to make others feel small. She had built a reputation for being both charming and ruthless, and Lily was her latest target. One afternoon, Lily was walking through the halls, minding her own business, when she passed by Emma and her group of friends near the lockers. As usual, the laughter from Emma's clique filled the air, but today, it felt different. Lily could sense the moment when their eyes shifted toward her, and she braced herself for the inevitable. Emma's voice, sweet and high-pitched, rang out mockingly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look who it is," she said, her eyes scanning Lily from head to toe. "The girl who thinks she belongs here. How cute." Lily's heart pounded, but she kept walking, pretending not to notice. She didn't want to give Emma the satisfaction of reacting. But the words stung like daggers. Emma's friends giggled, exchanging looks of approval, feeding off Emma's cruelty. "Oh, I'm sorry, was I too harsh?" Emma continued, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. She stepped closer to Lily, blocking her way. "I just think it's adorable that you try so hard to fit in. You're, like, the last person I'd expect to see in a place like this." Lily stood still, trying not to crumble under the pressure. The whole scene felt suffocating, like the walls of the hallway were closing in on her. She wanted to disappear, to find a way out, but Emma's words kept echoing in her mind. "You know," Emma added with a slight tilt of her head, her tone condescending, "this school isn't for everyone. It's for people who actually matter. People with money, with connections. Not, well, people like you." Lily's eyes flickered to the ground, her face burning with shame. Emma's words were always aimed to belittle her, to remind her of her place. Lily had never fit into this world of wealth and privilege. No matter how hard she tried to be just another student, Emma made sure to remind her that she didn't belong. Emma turned away with a satisfied smile, and her friends followed suit, their laughter echoing down the hallway as they left Lily standing there, paralyzed. The cruel mockery wasn't new to Lily, but today, it hurt more than usual. Emma had managed to turn a simple hallway encounter into another reminder of how little she mattered, at least in their eyes. Each day, Mrs. Holloway seemed to find new ways to undermine Lily, her criticisms becoming more overt, sharper with each passing class. It was as though Lily had become the teacher's personal target, her every mistake or failure amplified, her efforts ignored. Mrs. Holloway made it clear that Lily's place in the class was questionable, and the students, who had already formed their own judgments, watched with bated breath whenever Lily was called upon. One day, the class was in the middle of a discussion about the upcoming exam. Lily, as usual, tried to follow along but felt overwhelmed by the pressure to perform. Her mind raced, but the textbook, which she could barely afford, didn't offer the clarity she needed. She stared at the page, feeling more lost than ever. Mrs. Holloway noticed and didn't waste a moment. "Lily," she called out sharply, her voice cutting through the chatter, "can you tell us what the second paragraph of the reading is about?" Lily froze. The answer was just out of her reach, a jumble of words in her mind. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, their expectations hanging in the air. "I'm not sure, Mrs. Holloway," she said softly, trying to hold back the tremor in her voice. Mrs. Holloway raised an eyebrow, a smug smile playing at her lips. "You're not sure? You're not sure? How convenient." She leaned forward, placing her hands on her desk. "Lily, you've been in this class for months now. How many times have you been not sure? Maybe you're just not cut out for this. You can't even be bothered to study, can you?" The words stung like a slap, and Lily felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She opened her mouth, wanting to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that she didn't have the resources that others had, that she couldn't afford the extra tutoring or study guides that seemed to make everything so easy for her classmates? But the moment passed, and Mrs. Holloway was already moving on, leaving Lily to fester in her frustration. It wasn't the first time Mrs. Holloway had singled Lily out, but today, the teacher's words cut deeper. "Some people don't realize that success isn't for everyone, especially those who can't even try," she said dismissively, as though she were talking about a child who simply wasn't smart enough to try harder. The class seemed to hold its breath, some students trying to stifle giggles, others exchanging uncomfortable looks. But for Lily, the weight of the comment felt unbearable. She wanted to lash out, to scream that she did try, that she was trying every single day. But all she did was sit there, biting her lip, clenching her fists so tightly under the desk that her nails dug into her palms. Her stomach twisted in knots, and she could feel the frustration building up in her chest. It wasn't fair, none of it was fair. But she held it all in. She had to. If she let her emotions show, it would only make things worse. Her face remained neutral, almost blank, as she stared at the desk in front of her. But inside, there was a storm brewing. Lily had reached her breaking point, and the tension in her body was palpable. Her hands shook slightly, but she hid it well, not letting her emotions spill out. She had learned long ago how to hide her pain from the world. She had learned to endure, to hold back. But there was something more, something inside her that was beginning to grow, to push against the walls she had built around herself. She wasn't just going to take it anymore. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. There was strength hidden deep within her, strength she had never allowed herself to acknowledge, but one that was slowly beginning to surface. Have you ever faced unfair treatment like Lily? Maybe you've been criticized or belittled for something out of your control, or felt like you were judged based on appearances, background, or resources. How did it make you feel in those moments? Did it make you question your worth or drive you to push back? Share your experiences in the comments below. Let's support each other by acknowledging the challenges we've faced and how we've grown from them. Remember, no one should ever be made to feel small. Your voice matters. The tension in the classroom was palpable as Mrs. Holloway announced the details of the upcoming project. The assignment was a big one, worth a significant portion of the final grade. The students had to work in pairs, and as soon as Mrs. Holloway began calling out names, a sense of unease rippled through the room. Lily had been hoping to work with someone who wouldn't judge her, someone who might be kind, or at least neutral. But her hopes were quickly dashed when Mrs. Holloway paired her with Emma. Lily's stomach twisted. She had always felt like an outsider around Emma, and the idea of being forced to work with her on such an important project felt like a punishment. Emma had made her life difficult enough, and now, she would be in her presence every day for the next few weeks. Lily glanced at Emma, who was sitting with her arms crossed, her face already scrunched in displeasure. Emma's clique was whispering among themselves, and Lily knew they were probably making jokes at her expense. She couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment was a setup, one more way to make her feel inadequate. As Mrs. Holloway finished assigning pairs, Emma's voice rang out, louder than everyone else's. "Why am I stuck with her?" Emma's words were full of disgust, her eyes locked on Lily. "She can't keep up. I don't want my grades ruined because of her." Lily flinched at the comment, trying to avoid the gaze of her classmates, who were now watching the exchange. It wasn't the first time Emma had made her feel small, but every new insult seemed to hit harder than the last. Mrs. Holloway turned her gaze toward Emma, a subtle smile on her face as though she enjoyed the drama unfolding before her. "Well, Emma, maybe this will be a good opportunity for Lily to work harder," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "If she really wants to succeed, she should put in the effort." Emma smirked, clearly satisfied with the teacher's response. She tossed her hair back arrogantly and gave Lily a pointed look. "Good luck," Emma muttered under her breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't mess this up for me." Lily's heart sank. She had hoped for at least a little support, but it was clear that no one cared about her efforts. The weight of Emma's words and Mrs. Holloway's indifference settled over her like a heavy cloud. "Maybe I should just work alone," Lily suggested quietly, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure if she could handle another round of humiliation, but she also knew the project was important, and she didn't want to fail. Still, the idea of working with Emma, the same girl who had tormented her for so long, felt impossible. But Mrs. Holloway's sharp response stopped Lily in her tracks. "You don't get to work alone, Lily," she snapped, her tone final. "If you want to prove yourself, you'll work with Emma. That's how life works. Deal with it?" Lily nodded, her throat tight, though she didn't trust herself to speak. She couldn't avoid it. She was stuck with Emma now, forced to face the daily cruelty of being paired with someone who openly mocked her. The assignment, which should have been an opportunity for growth, now felt like yet another burden in a life that already felt impossible. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Lily gathered her things in silence, dreading the days to come. As Lily sat in her seat, trying to hold herself together, the entire class seemed to hang in a tense silence, waiting for the fallout. Mrs. Holloway's words had cut deep, and Emma's ridicule had only made things worse. Yet, it wasn't just the cruel words that stung, it was the reaction of the class. Their laughter, their uncomfortable shuffling, and their silent complicity left a bitter taste in Lily's mouth. Some of the students were openly amused by the spectacle. A few of Emma's friends stifled their giggles behind their hands, exchanging smirks as they glanced at Lily. The girl sitting 2 rows behind her, Sarah, whispered something to her friend and then turned toward Lily, her eyes filled with pity. But the pity wasn't kind, it was judgment. Sarah's gaze lingered for a moment too long before she looked away, clearly uncomfortable but too afraid to do anything about it. Across the room, a few students exchanged whispered comments. Did you see the look on Lily's face? She looked so embarrassed, one boy muttered to his friend. Another girl, more outspoken, gave a little laugh. Well, maybe she'll learn to work harder, she said, as though it was somehow Lily's fault that she was treated this way. They all knew what had happened, but none of them spoke up. None of them tried to defend Lily. Lily's footsteps were slow and measured as she walked into the principal's office, the unease in her chest growing heavier with each passing second. As the door swung open, she wasn't met with the usual stern gaze of Principal Williams, but instead with something far more unexpected. A tall, impeccably dressed man who was standing by the window, watching the world outside with an air of quiet authority. His expensive suit, sharp features, and composed demeanor immediately caught Lily off guard. The man turned around as soon as Lily entered, and her breath caught in her throat. Her father? Lily's eyes widened in disbelief. This was not the man she had seen a few times at parent-teacher conferences. This was someone entirely different, someone who radiated power, confidence, and influence. Her father's gaze softened when he saw her, and despite his intimidating appearance, there was an unmistakable warmth in his eyes. He walked toward her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but it was clear he wasn't here for a casual visit. Lily, he said gently, his voice deep and calm, but carrying a weight that commanded respect. I'm sorry you had to go through this. Lily blinked, still in shock, and tried to collect herself. She had no idea why he was here, or what was going on, but it seemed that the sudden meeting with the principal wasn't just a random occurrence. The door opened again, and Principal Williams entered, a nervous expression on his face. Mrs. Holloway followed behind him, her usual smug expression replaced with one of confusion and unease. Mr. Andrews, Lily's father, straightened up as he addressed the principal. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of authority that made even the principal stiffen. I didn't expect my daughter to be treated this way, Mr. Andrews began, his words carefully chosen, yet sharp. In a place that is supposed to uplift young minds and prepare them for the future, this kind of behavior is not acceptable. My daughter deserves respect, just like every other student in this school. Principal Williams' face turned pale. The revelation that Lily's father was someone of such high status seemed to shake him to his core. Mrs. Holloway, too, stood frozen, her jaw slightly agape as she processed the information. Her demeanor shifted instantly from dismissive to visibly uncomfortable. Mr. Andrews didn't give them a chance to respond. He took a step forward, his voice firm. This school has an image problem, and I'm afraid that if these kinds of behaviors continue, there will be consequences. There are other schools, better schools, that would be honored to have my daughter attend. But more than that, I expect you to address this culture of judgment and ridicule that has taken root here. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Lily could feel her heart beating faster in her chest. She had never seen her father like this, calm, yet so unwavering. She had always known that he was successful, but she had never realized just how much power he held until now. Mrs. Holloway opened her mouth to say something, but then closed it, clearly at a loss for words. Principal Williams cleared his throat and nodded quickly, clearly trying to regain his composure. "Mr. Andrews, we will absolutely look into this matter," he said, his voice slightly strained. "I assure you, we take these concerns very seriously." "Good," Mr. Andrews replied simply, his gaze never wavering. "Because if things don't change, I'll have no choice but to take further action. I trust we won't need to escalate this." The principal nodded quickly, practically stammering, "Of course, Mr. Andrews. We'll ensure this doesn't happen again." With that, Mr. Andrews turned to Lily and smiled warmly, the sternness of his earlier words fading as he looked at her with pride. "Let's go home, Lily. I'm proud of you for staying strong." Lily stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. She had never imagined that her father could wield such influence. She had always thought of him as just a successful businessman, not someone who could command respect in a room like this. The shock of the reveal was overwhelming, and she didn't know whether to feel embarrassed or relieved. But as they left the office, she couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. She had never needed to prove herself to anyone, but now, it seemed, she was about to have her moment. The tables had turned, and she wasn't the one who needed to apologize anymore. As Lily walked out of the principal's office with her father by her side, something within her had shifted. The timid, shy girl who had once cowered under the weight of judgment and ridicule was now gone. In her place stood a girl who radiated confidence, her posture straight, her head held high. The uncertainty that had clouded her eyes was replaced with a newfound strength. Her father's presence, his words of reassurance, and the revelation of her true identity had empowered her in ways she hadn't anticipated. When she entered the classroom the next day, her classmates immediately noticed the difference. The once timid Lily, who had always sat quietly at the back of the room, now walked in with a purposeful stride. She no longer flinched under the weight of harsh stares. Instead, she met the eyes of her peers with a calm defiance, challenging anyone who dared to look down on her. Mrs. Holloway, who had once been so dismissive, couldn't help but glance nervously at Lily as she passed. The shift in Lily's demeanor was undeniable. There was no more fear in her eyes, only a quiet but unshakable strength that made even the most confident students second-guess their assumptions. The whispers started again, but this time, they weren't of mockery. The students murmured in awe, speculating on what had changed. Who was this new Lily? The girl who had once been an easy target for bullying was now someone who commanded respect, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The buzz of whispers that filled the classroom was palpable, but this time, there was a different tone. It wasn't the usual mockery or judgment, but a quiet mix of awe, confusion, and regret. The students who had once looked down on Lily now watched her with hesitant eyes, as if they were seeing her for the first time. The girl who had once been the target of their ridicule was no longer the same. She had changed, not just in how she carried herself, but in the way she made them feel. Emma, who had been the ringleader of the bullying, sat at her desk, her arms crossed in front of her. Her gaze lingered on Lily, but it wasn't the smug, superior look she had worn before. Instead, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She glanced over at her friends, who were all similarly silent, and the regret in their expressions was unmistakable. They had underestimated Lily, assumed that her humble appearance defined her worth. But now, after witnessing her transformation, they realized how wrong they had been. One of the boys who had often laughed at Lily now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He avoided looking at her directly, as though ashamed of his previous behavior. Another girl, who had been a silent bystander in all the mocking, leaned over to her friend and whispered, "I didn't know, she's amazing." Lily didn't acknowledge their gazes, nor did she feel the need to. She wasn't looking for validation anymore. The change wasn't for them, it was for her. The looks of regret, the realization that they had misjudged her, were all just a part of the process. She had shown them her true strength, and that was all that mattered. The classroom fell into an uncomfortable silence as the principal's voice echoed over the intercom, his announcement clear and direct. "Attention, students. I regret to inform you that Mrs. Holloway will be on temporary leave effective immediately. Due to her inappropriate behavior and failure to treat all students equally, the school administration has decided to take action. The news hit like a shockwave. Whispers broke out immediately, some of the students exchanging stunned glances, while others seemed relieved. The weight of Mrs. Holloway's dismissal was palpable, but what was most striking was the shift in the atmosphere. Where there had once been tension, now there was a strange sense of justice, a feeling that something wrong had been corrected. Lily couldn't suppress a small, quiet sigh of relief. She didn't need to feel vindicated, but seeing Mrs. Holloway face the consequences of her actions brought a sense of closure. The teacher who had humiliated her and others had finally been held accountable. For once, it wasn't the victim who was blamed, but the one who perpetuated the injustice. As the principal's voice continued over the intercom, he mentioned that the school would be conducting an investigation into the overall environment and behavior of staff members. This wasn't just about Mrs. Holloway, it was about fostering a school culture of respect and inclusion for everyone, no matter their background. The room was filled with mixed reactions. Some students, like Emma, who had once been a vocal supporter of Mrs. Holloway's harsh methods, now sat in stunned silence. Others felt a sense of empowerment, knowing that their voices had finally been heard. Lily, however, stood quietly at her desk, a calm expression on her face. She didn't need to celebrate this moment. It was enough to know that the change had come, and that, from now on, things would be different. The message was clear: no one would be underestimated again. The school bell rang loudly, signaling the end of another day. As students began to file out of the classroom, heading toward their lockers and the exits, there was an unexpected pause. Lily, standing at the front of the room, cleared her throat. Her heart raced, but there was a calmness in her demeanor that only seemed to strengthen as she stood tall before her classmates. One by one, the students turned their heads, sensing something important was about to unfold. Emma, who had once been one of her greatest tormentors, stood at her desk, arms crossed, waiting for Lily to speak. Mrs. Holloway was no longer present, and the room felt different, lighter, almost. But there was still a lingering tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to click into place. Lily took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over her peers. She could see the looks of uncertainty and regret in their eyes, but also something else, a glimmer of hope. A glimmer that maybe, just maybe, they had learned something valuable. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of the words she was about to say pressing on her chest. But then, she stepped forward, her voice breaking the silence with quiet confidence. "You all know me as the quiet girl, the one who always kept to herself, the one who never really fit in. I know you saw me as someone who didn't belong here, that I was too different, too out of place for a school like this. I know you made judgments about me, about my clothes, about my family, about who I am and what I have." She paused, letting her words settle in the room. She could feel the shift in the energy around her. Her classmates were listening now. They weren't sneering or whispering. They were actually listening. "But you didn't know me," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "You didn't know that the value of a person doesn't come from the brand of their clothes or the number in their bank account. The truth is, everyone deserves respect, whether they're rich or poor. What matters is what's inside, not what's on the outside." Lily's words hung in the air, carrying a weight that no one in the room could ignore. She wasn't speaking to just the bullies anymore. She was speaking to everyone, including herself. She was finally owning her truth, and it was clear to everyone present that this wasn't just a lesson for them, it was a lesson for her as well. She took another step forward, her eyes now focused solely on Emma, who seemed to be avoiding her gaze. "I don't expect any of you to change overnight, but I do hope you'll think twice the next time you judge someone based on how they look or where they come from. Because that person you're looking down on could be someone you need one day. Or maybe someone who just needs a little kindness to show you who they really are." Her words were simple, but they carried with them a profound truth that rippled through the room. The students looked at each other, many of them finally understanding the weight of their actions. Some faces flushed with shame, while others were deep in thought, processing the impact of her message. Lily's gaze softened as she looked around the room. "I'm not perfect, and I've made my mistakes too. But I'm learning just like all of you are. So, let's promise to do better. Let's promise to see people for who they really are, not just who we think they are." And most importantly, let's promise to treat each other with respect. The room was silent for a moment, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was one of reflection, of realization. A few students nodded, and even Emma, despite her earlier arrogance, couldn't help but meet Lily's eyes with something that resembled respect. Lily smiled softly, her heart light. She wasn't looking for applause, nor was she waiting for her peers to apologize. What mattered was that she had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had planted a seed, one that would grow in the hearts of those who had hurt her. The lesson was clear. Respect isn't earned by wealth, status, or appearance. It's earned by the kindness and strength within a person. With that, Lily turned and walked out of the classroom, her steps steady, her heart unburdened. She had found her voice, and it was a voice that no one would ever silence again. Never judge a book by its cover. True worth is hidden within. Share this story if you believe everyone deserves respect. Have you ever been underestimated? Share your story in the comments below. Lily's journey isn't just hers, it's something many of us can relate to. Have you ever been judged by your appearance, underestimated because of where you come from or what you have? Maybe you've faced moments of humiliation or struggle that seemed impossible to overcome. Or maybe, like Lily, you found your strength when others least expected it. We all have a story to tell. The video encourages viewers to open up, offering a space for them to share their own experiences and reflections. We want to hear from you. Your story matters. Share how you've overcome being underestimated, how you've found your strength, or even how you've learned to see others differently. Together, we can create a community of empowerment and support. Let's inspire each other. If you've been moved by Lily's story, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Whether it's a friend, family member, or anyone who might be facing judgment or struggles, remind them of their worth. Let's spread the message that everyone deserves respect and understanding, no matter their appearance, background, or circumstances. Your share could make a difference in someone's life today.